Dr. Herman Pontzer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to speak with you. I've been a big fan for many years, and I've read a lot of your papers. So you're an evolutionary anthropologist at Duke University and one of the leading researchers on human metabolism and energy expenditure, which we'll get into. You spent decades doing fieldwork with the Hadza, if I understand correctly, the hunter-gatherers in Tanzania.
Mm-hmm.
You've done some work with chimpanzees in Uganda and measuring metabolism across the human lifespan. So can you tell us, how did you get into this field? Like, it's a very unique area of study. I happen to be fascinated by it, but how did you get interested in that?
Yeah, so I took a couple of anthropology classes as an undergraduate at Penn State a long time ago, back in the 90s. And I didn't know what I wanted to do at the time for a career or anything like that. I was just a freshman in college. But I got super excited by the idea of sort of investigating and understanding human evolution, what our past was like and how we got to be the way we are, and how that kind of evolutionary understanding just changes the way you look at the world, the way you look at yourselves and other people and the world around us. And so I got super excited about that. And then, as you kind of delve into evolution and how species change and evolve, what you realize is so much of it is a game of energy, right? Getting energy from your landscape, from the diet you eat, from, and turning that energy into babies, basically. Converting energy into babies is the name of the game. And so from the very beginning of my sort of intellectual adulthood, I've been interested in energy expenditure as a way of understanding our species and ourselves. And then, that has translated into studies of metabolism across, human populations, across other primates, like you say. And so that's where that interest comes from.
Awesome. I love it. And I want to dig into this about hunter-gatherers. So what they actually eat. We hear a lot about the paleo diet this today. A lot of people, I think, have maybe a mixed understanding of what people actually eat, and maybe we don't actually know exactly what hunter-gatherers ate, hundreds of thousands of years ago. But you did a lot of work with the Hadza. So your 2021 paper in particular in the Annual Review of Nutrition with Brian Wood, you really examine hunter-gatherer diets through this evolution, ecology, economy framework, right? And you specifically look at some studies with the Hadza, but you're looking at sort of different hunter-gatherers that we have some data on at all. So can you tell us about what do different hunter-gatherers eat in warm climates, at the poles, different areas?
Sure, yeah. So, when you delve into the literature on what people eat, across cultures, especially across hunting and gathering cultures. So these are cultures that don't have any farmed animals or farmed plants. They all eat all wild foods from the landscape around them. We have ethnographic records going back at least a couple hundred years and perhaps even earlier than that. So we have a pretty good record, even though a lot of these cultures are kind of, no longer hunting and gathering today. We have a pretty good record of what hundreds of different cultures were doing, across the globe. And, I guess it's not surprising on one level, they eat what's around them, right? They eat what's available. So humans are evolved to be, opportunistic omnivores. We're very good at making a meal of almost anything that's there. And so what that means is that in warm climates, you find cultures eating a lot of plants because plants grow great in warm climates. Towards the poles and cold climates, you see people eating, more meat because there's fewer plants that grow very well there. But in almost any, pick your latitude, pick your geography, pick your circumstance, you can find all kinds of different solutions to this problem of what to eat. A big mix of plants and animals are on the menu.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm hearing omnivores, right? Opportunistic. We eat or what our food environment sort of suggests we should eat. It's what's available. Yeah. Obviously, our food environment's very different today. A lot of highly processed foods. So you mentioned about how many plants and how many animals. That depends on where in the world you are. Can you tell us, like, proportionally, whether that's the amount of calories or the amount sort of the mass quantities? How does that make up the diet?
Yeah, I mean, we think about, your diet in terms of, in the proportions that your diet comes from. We think about that usually in terms of the calories you're getting, because
Hmm.
obviously, a whole lot of celery, doesn't have much calories in it compared to that amount of volume of meat or of a lot of other foods. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm talking about proportions of calories coming in. And these are rough estimates, right? When we go back to the ethnographic records that might be 100 or 200 years old, well, okay, we don't have down to the gram or down to the calorie precisely what foods are being eaten. So some of this is an estimate, but we do know, that it's a mix of foods, in terms of what's being eaten calorically of plants and animals.
Yeah. Okay. Some sort of mix of foods, quite a big range, and toward the poles we see much more animal source foods, warm weather climates. I think your paper in 2021 said around half of the calories were from animals, half of the calories from
Sure.
plants on average,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
But like if you look at just the equatorial groups, for example, so groups that are in and around the equator, yeah, if you were to average it all up across all these cultures, you'll see it's about a 50-50 mix. But I can find within that data set, I can find some cultures that eat a lot of animals. I can find cultures that eat a lot of plants, and then you can begin to understand if I am a diet tribalist, right? And I don't want to promote my particular version of the world and my particular view of the world. Well, I can cherry pick, right? And I can say, well, look,
Hmm.
so and so culture eats all meat, and they're this great, wonderful example of what we used to be like. And somebody else can say, look, they eat all plants, and this is the example of how we used to be. And the answer is they're both right, right? Which
Hmm.
makes nobody happy, but is the truth.
Yeah, I love it. You just want to share what the evidence is, right? It's not being dogmatic. It's not being tribalist. So your data also showed on meat consumption specifically among within just the Hadza. So I know that that varies between tribes, but you said
Yeah.
also in this studies we see a lot of variation from day to day. So you may not have really any meat one day, and then you may have a kill, and then you eat a lot of meat.
Yeah.
Do you see also variation within the members within a particular community or group?
That's interesting. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of great data on sort of between individual variation, at least not that I'm aware of. Brian Wood might, because he's a real expert on this. And he's been living with the Hadza, even doing even more work than I have. And so, but anyway, I don't think we have good data on individual variation. And what we typically see is a lot of sharing, right? And so, um, it's more the case that whatever comes into camp gets fairly evenly distributed. And so, the camp might not have a lot of meat today because none of the hunters came home, with a kill. But so then everybody will be eating tubers. And then tomorrow, when, somebody gets lucky and brings back an impala, everybody's eating meat that day. So I think it's more that's more of the variation is day to day, and maybe over the course of a year, rather than
Yeah.
individual to individual.
Yeah, okay, it's circumstantial to what sort of is available, like you said. What do they actually
Yeah.
what food is on the menu? And there's also, I think, surprising to maybe people who aren't very familiar, honey is a big part of the
Oh,
Hadza diet, right? Tell us about
yeah.
honey. Do people eat a lot of honey? Is it just depends on if it's there? How does that
I
work?
mean, yeah, they can always find honey. Sometimes of the year are better than others. But yeah, some parts of the year, when flowers are in bloom and bees are making a lot of honey, uh, honey can be 20% of the diet sometimes, right? It's an enormous amount of the calories that come into camp. And so, it's they really depend on that as an energy source. Of course, it's just sugar and water. There's nothing special about, honey in
Mhm.
that part of the world. And so it really is a simple carbohydrate. That's another story that you often hear with paleo diet folks is there's no sugars. There's plenty of sugars in honey, and that's a big part of the diet. And it's not just the Hadza. I mean, if we look across places where it's ever documented, people eat honey wherever there are bees. And it's actually one of these things that we miss in the old ethnographic literature. We think the ethnographic literature tends to overlook women's contributions because a lot of these explorers were men and they were focused on what the men were doing. And a lot of them kind of seem to ignore honey, which we know they're missing in some of these cultures because we have other data that say, oh, you guys missed this, in this culture. So
Yeah.
we know they're missing the honey a lot of the time. So anyway, but
Yeah.
honey's a big part of the story.
That reminds me, in studies today, we often don't include women in the data set. It's like it's white men who are studied, and so it's like that started a long time ago, right? We need to
Yeah.
fix that. So obviously, there's a lot of talk of the paleo diet and sort of the evolutionary perspective of what we evolved to eat versus what we eat now. Now, I
Hmm.
just want to start before we get into the sort of cardiometabolic diseases within these hunter-gatherers. What is your perspective on how do we translate evolutionary diets to current diets? Is there no relationship? Is it just like it's whatever was available? Or is it sort of that sort of helps until reproduction, but it's not for longevity?
Yeah.
Or where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that, just because people used to eat a particular food, whether this is 100,000 years ago or 100 years ago, doesn't mean necessarily that we ought to eat it today. Right? So we should move away from the kind of naturalistic fallacy that just because people used to do it, it's definitely a good idea to do it now. On the other hand, we know that the foods that those folks are eating are, they're unprocessed foods. There's not a lot of additives in it, that kind of thing. And we know there's good evidence from controlled studies in, modern societies that those are better foods for you. Unprocessed or less processed foods are associated with better health outcomes. And so I do think that those kind of subsistence culture, farming and foraging diets are a good place to start if we want to understand, the foods that our bodies are best adapted to. It's not the end of the story. Anyway, and the translation from what you can eat in a Hadza hunting and gathering camp to what you'll find in the supermarket, I think, is worth a discussion. But I do think it's a good place to start.
Yeah, good starting place. We don't want to sort of say just because it was eaten means it's what we should eat today or in the same amounts. And I think we can dig into this a little bit more, but what was eaten and what was sort of wild is very different, right? We know about the domestication of crops. We lost a lot of sort of nutrient density, fiber. The domestication of animals, we gained a lot of fat. So it's very different products that we're eating today in general, right, than these hunter-gatherers. But let's talk about their health, okay? Have you measured? My understanding is that there's not a lot of the sort of chronic diseases that we see today, the diabetes, heart disease, things like that. What is the health status? Do you have sort of data on whether that's sort of incidence of disease, whether it's markers of lipids like cholesterol or triglycerides? Where do they sit, most of the hunter-gatherers?
Yeah, so we've got data on the Hadza community as well as groups kind of like them and groups that do a little bit of farming as well across the globe. And I'd say we probably have good data now on probably it's a dozen or so of these cultures and from different studies over the years and different research groups. And they all point to the same thing, which is these communities, including the Hadza, have incredibly healthy hearts, right? Very little high blood pressure, for example, very little evidence of arterial disease. They have almost no incidence of diabetes and associated, obesity and diabetes, I should say. Even cognitive health seems pretty good into old age. And these are folks that are in their 60s and 70s that we can measure pretty readily. So it isn't like, we don't have any old folks to check. We have plenty, and they're doing great. In fact, they're doing better on average than we do here as we age.
That's a common misconception, right? I mean, people say, well, all of the hunter-gatherers, they died really early, so we don't really know. But you're saying at least the modern hunter-gatherers that we do have data on, there's definitely some data in those 60 to 70-year-old age groups.
Completely, yeah. And in fact, even, in the deep past, we would have seen people in their 60s and 70s, even early 80s, I think, in these communities. People kind of get fixated on the life expectancy number, right? And so the life expectancy is just, it's a very simple calculation. If I'm born today, what's my expected number of years of life before I die? And that number is always really low in these cultures, in the 30s sometimes. And so it might make you think that nobody's around in their 50s and 60s and 70s to even get heart disease. But that's not what that number means. It just means that you have a lot of childhood mortality, sadly, in these groups because they don't have antibiotics and vaccines. And so because of that really high childhood mortality, it drags that average life expectancy down. And it kind of gives us a false impression of life expectancy.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about lipids and cholesterol specifically because that is a very big topic in terms of heart disease risk. And when we talk about saturated fat, we talk about the animal source foods in the diet versus the plant source foods. Can you tell us, one, What were their lipids like cholesterol, LDL, if you have ApoB or other markers? And then what type of like ratios of these like fats are we seeing? Like, is there a lot of saturated fat? What form does it come in the
Mhm.
diet?
Yeah, so the first one's easier, and I don't have the data in front of me to give you exact numbers, but we have lipid panels on the Hadza and on a group called the Schwar and on a group called the Chimani. We've reviewed that in a couple of papers. There are other populations that are published now too. And, triglyceride levels are low, cholesterol levels are low, um, you know, really low. Like, so, the idea that somehow, and I've seen this in the social media world, that somehow high cholesterol levels can be healthy or are paleo, we don't see that at all, actually. We see exactly what you'd expect from the American Heart Association, which is that these really healthy hearts are associated with really low levels of triglycerides and cholesterols. Glucose is, fasting glucose is also, we do it as the, what is it, milligrams per deciliter or whatever. So you're below 100 typically with fasting glucose in these groups as well. And so, exactly what you'd expect for a healthy blood panel is what we see for glucose and lipid levels in these groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forget if that gets us to. We haven't done ApoB. We haven't done. Sorry. Then you asked about saturated versus unsaturated fats. We don't have great data on that because most of the foods that are being eaten haven't been through the full testing to sort of find out, what's the percentages of different fat types there. But what we can say is, from what we do know, is that wild game in general tends to have much less saturated fat than the domesticated animals that we eat, from the kind of industrialized farming system that we have today. And so, part of that is what they're fed. Part of that is how they're raised. I don't know all the details of the husbandry, but we do seem to have more saturated fat in the animals that are in the supermarket than you would find, wild on the landscape.
And any hunter gatherers consuming dairy products.
I mean, kind of by definition, no, because you have to have domesticated animals to have dairy products. But we do have data on some, on groups that live with their cattle. We call them pastoralists. So if you have,
Right.
if you live with your goat herds or your cattle herds or both, they drink a fair amount of milk and that kind of stuff and blood. And often they're held up as like the epitome of past diets and what we all used to eat. The Maasai are often held up as this example.
Mhm.
Interestingly, those groups also eat, a mixed diet. It isn't all animal foods, first of all, and second of all, that lifestyle of living with your herds and eating, a lot of blood and milk and meat is actually is not even as old as sort of traditional cereal farming is. Right?
Mhm.
So,
Right.
we've had domesticated plants for longer than we've had domesticated animals, and so to hold that up
Mhm.
as like the paleo, icon is to somebody who knows their history is a little bit funny because that's not how
It's
it
a
works.
it's kinda like marketing. It's just kinda like yeah.
Yeah.
It's the sort of image of it. Okay, so what about other sources from plants? Any sort of like palm fruit, palm oil, anything that hunter gatherers would
Yeah.
consume in saturated fat from plants?
Well, I mean, in some places in the world, yes. The places where I work, it's less common. I just can't think of any. We don't think. I mean, unless I'm forgetting something, but I don't think we have any plant sources that are high in lipids. Like, there's no avocado growing in the wild in where I work in East Africa.
Or
Um,
coconut, right?
or coconut for that matter. But, I mean, I think groups that have access to those foods would eat them, so I'm sure you can find examples of people and peoples who are taking advantage of those foods. But again, it's not a huge contributor to the groups that I know well.
How about the Inuit,
Mm.
up north consuming more of that fat? Do you know anything about their lipid status, their health?
Yeah, so I don't know that, first of all, there aren't a lot of great data on those groups with modern methods because, some of the data go back to the sort of old Arctic explorers. And as I mentioned before, some of those accounts we know are missing important, key pieces. Um,
Mhm.
But here's a few things we do know about the Inuit and other Arctic groups. First of all, in a lot of those groups, they seem to have there's an allele, a gene variant that makes them unable to sort of easily go into ketosis. So they actually don't, even though they eat a really high meat diet, in some cases and sometimes of the year, they aren't sort of producing ketones in the way that a lot of the paleo folks think is the key to health, right? So it isn't.
Interesting.
And that seems to be an adaptation, perhaps, to eating so much meat, is that their bodies are sort of pushing back against producing ketones as easily. Secondly, we also know that when they can, they're eating carbohydrates and plant sources. Not throughout the year, of course, because sometimes there just is nothing there available to eat plant-wise.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're a great example. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I don't want to try to explain them away. They're a great example of human adaptation and human cultural adaptation to survive, all over the globe. And again, we're omnivores, right? We can eat a really high meat diet like we do with the Inuit. But there's reasons to think that they're not sort of the key paleo example. Again,
Right.
they also aren't a good model for most of our evolutionary history, which has happened mostly in the tropics.
Right.
Living in the Arctic is maybe not even as old as pastoralism. It might, it's like 8,000 years old or something like that, 7,000 years old for the earliest evidence of groups making a living in the Arctic. Anyway, so it's not a good example of our history, but it's a nice example of how adaptive we can be.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now let's think about in terms of the tropics.
Yeah.
I know we discussed this, but what is the lowest amount of animal source foods you've seen kind of in a particular group? Like, is it 15? Is it down to 15%? Is it down to 0? Is it 20%, 25?
Well, over what time frames, right? I mean, there are certainly days in a Hadza camp where there's no meat, right? So over that day, yeah, it was 0%. If we look kind of at the ethnographic records, there are some groups that sort of seem to average, less than 10 or 15%. Now you can ask, well, when was the ethnographer there? Were they there at a particularly bad time for meat or something like that? So, I really like to stay away from getting I realize it's helpful to kind of talk about these percentages. I would encourage all of us to treat those with a grain of salt, right? I mean, maybe it's, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15, maybe it's the time of the year. But the point is, yes, there are some groups that are quite low, at least in the recorded, in the records of these things.
Quite a big range, and I think that's what's sort of can be surprising to people. It's just here, like people were opportunistic, and really, there's a lot of examples of these groups being pretty healthy on a range of different proportions of animal source foods in the diet. I think that's really interesting.
And that's, for me, that's really the key, because the folks who are trying to push a paleo, a particular version of a paleo diet that says you have to eat this particular way, and if you don't do that, you're not going to be healthy. And they would say, because look, people who are eating paleo diets today, hunter-gatherers today, are really healthy. Well, okay, it's true that, for example, the Hadza are quite healthy. They're a great model for heart health. But those same Hadza communities we've measured their heart health and they're so healthy are not eating a particularly paleo diet, right? In terms of eating an all-meat diet or anything like that.
Right.
The healthiest hearts ever measured are probably in the Chimani community in Bolivia. They do some hunting and gathering along with some farming. And, they're farming yucca, which is and plantain, and these really carbohydrate-rich foods as their staple foods, right? If you go to a meal, you're going to get served a lot of carbohydrate. And quite little protein, in fact. I mean, and certainly very little fat. Well, okay, their hearts are incredibly healthy. And if they're not paleo, I don't know who can claim the title.
Right.
But it's not this meat first version of paleo, right? So, sure, you have groups like the Inuit who do eat a lot of meat. That's true. It's an interesting story what's going on there, and it shows our adaptability. But you can't sort of claim an Inuit diet and then pair that with Chimani heart health and say that you've got a coherent story. You don't, right? You're sort of picking and choosing to sort of push a particular version of the world.
Yeah, I love to hear the data, because there is this big push about like carbohydrates being harmful. You can't have a lot of carbohydrates in the diet, and then On the other side of things, you hear a lot of push of like, we have to go fully plant-based. And I think there's just so many different ways to have a healthy diet, right? And for me also, I'm hearing like one of the myths is like, it's not high in saturated fats. Like, not that I have I'm not particularly
Yeah.
against foods with saturated fats, but the wild diets of the Hadza and other warm climate hunter-gatherers did not consume a lot of saturated fat, right?
Yeah. I mean, we have no
So,
evidence for that at all. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So let's get into the constrained energy model and exercise, which you've also written about. And I think you lived, or you were kind of with the Hadza for quite some time to observe them, right? To kind of learn.
Yeah. So we wanted to. This is with Brian Wood, and I just want to give a shout out to him. It's true. I've had a chance to do field work with the Hadza and live with them, and that's been wonderful, and it really kind of changed, a lot of how I think about ourselves and our species. But it's really Brian. He's spent even more time there, and was sort of our gateway there, and we still work with him when we do Hadza work. So he's a Hadza cultural sort of expert and a great resource and a good friend and a colleague. So
that's great. That's great. Let's talk about the sort of movement and the energy expenditure.
Yeah.
I have read that the Hadza, they take a lot of steps. So over this 10,000, right? Like maybe up to close to 20,000, 10 to 20,000 per day.
Yeah.
Tell us about
right.
that. Does that influence their energy expenditure a lot?
Yeah. So when we first started working there, and I talked Brian into going and doing these measurements. So I should start off by saying, in 2008 or 9 or so, a few of us, me, Brian, and a guy named Dave Reichland, got this idea to measure total energy expenditures, all the calories that you burn per day, in a hunting and gathering community, because it hadn't been done. And at the time, we thought that was a really important data point to have, because we had sort of daily calories burned in the US and in Europe and other, developed populations and industrialized populations. But there was this sense that maybe we don't burn as many calories as we used to, and we were, back in the day, back in our evolutionary past. And maybe that difference in energy expenditure, the fact that we have low energy expenditures now, might be a reason that we have obesity and that kind of thing. But we didn't, you can't take a time machine to the past. And the next best thing you can do is ask, well, in a population that today is hunting and gathering, are they burning more calories, or how many more calories are they burning because they're so physically active, right? And so we were able to go and ask that question and do that study with the Hadza. Who they're not ancestral to anybody. We're all equally here and alive now today, but they're a nice model for what the past cultures might have been like in that way, because they hunt and gather, they're really physically active, and like you say, men and women are getting well over 10,000 steps a day. I think the average for an adult Hadza woman is 12 or 13,000 steps a day. The average for an adult Hadza man is 19,000 steps a day. So incredibly physically active. They get more activity in a day than most American youths get in a week. And so, we went out to Tanzania, got all our permits and all that kind of stuff sorted out, and made, got grant and support, the whole thing. It was a lot of effort to do it. And spent that first summer out there to measure energy expenditures using this technique called doubly labeled water. So it's this really accurate technique where you use isotopically enriched water to track how much carbon dioxide the body makes over about a week to 2 week period.
Okay.
So it's a real physiological measure of calories burned. Very well validated, really accurate. We got the data back from that study, because we have to take urine samples, bring them back home, get them analyzed in a lab here in the U.S. So it took some time to get the data. When we finally saw the data, we were really shocked, because their total energy expenditures, the calories they burn per day, was no different than folks in the U.S. It was exactly the same, in fact. And let me even crazier, perhaps. It's actually less than we burn here. But it happens to be that they're a bit smaller body. People tend to be a little bit shorter, a little less body weight, right? So we have to correct for the body size differences. Once you correct for the body size differences, there's no difference at all.
No difference
between Hadza men and women and men and women in the U.S. Completely the same. Indistinguishable.
How do you explain that? Are that they're moving so much more? Why don't they burn more energy?
Yeah. Well, we've been trying to track that answer down for about 15 years now. This is what we It's helpful when we have these sort of big, hard questions to think about the evidence and then think about the explanations separately, right? So the evidence, the data, are really clear. Groups like the Hadza, because we've done this in other populations too, groups like the Hadza don't burn more calories than folks in the US or elsewhere. I mean, not all, I mean, there's variation across cultures. Some are a little higher, some are a little bit lower, but it's not the case that, more activity leads to more energy expenditure across cultures. It isn't just this simple story where the more active cultures are burning more calories at all. That's the observation. Our hypothesis is, our explanation for that is that, people's bodies are adjusting to their activity levels so that if they spend more calories on activity, which they're certainly doing, they're certainly spending more energy on activity than we are, their bodies must be spending less on other tasks, on other physiological tasks, so that the net, total end of the day cost is not any different, right? So they're sort of balancing the books. It's like an energy budget. And if you spend more on activity, that means you got to spend less on something else because the total budget doesn't change, right? And so we've been tracking that down, and it seems like that's the case. And so we look at different sources of evidence. One piece of the puzzle is that when we look at people who exercise compared to people who don't, we see that people who exercise have less inflammation. They have, reproductive hormones like testosterone and estrogen are at a more moderated level. They respond to stress less. They have less adrenaline response and less cortisol response to stress. So all these little things that are helping them save calories, right? If you have less inflammation, your immune system is saving calories. It's not as active. If your testosterone and estrogen levels are a little bit lower, you're going to save calories because those hormones promote cell activity. So if you have less of them, presumably you're saving energy that way. Less epinephrine, adrenaline, less cortisol. We know that is associated with less energy expenditure. And so we think that's how the body is sort of, balancing the books.
It's fascinating. And I think, it could be easy for somebody to take away from that, exercise doesn't matter. Why should I even move around? But I'm sure that's clearly not the case, right? For other health conditions, you already said lower inflammation, right? There's a lot of reasons. Is that kind of how you think about exercise? More of like, we get a lot of health benefits from it. It may not be the primary thing that helps us stay sort of lean long term.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what I think, it's these adjustments your body's making, they are in large part the reasons that exercise is so good for you, right? So those adjustments are great for your long-term health. And there's so many good reasons to exercise, including your mood, cognitive health, staying sharp as you age, keeping your muscle mass up. All those things are really important too. But what it also means is that exercise is not a great way to, quote unquote, boost your metabolism, right? It's not going to have the impact on the calories you're burning every day the way that you think it does. It just isn't going to move the needle very much, if at all. And because of that, it's not a great tool for weight loss. It just doesn't have a big effect on weight, period, your exercise regimes. And so, yes, you should exercise. But if you want to think about weight, then the diet side of the equation and the energy that you're eating is really what you want to focus on.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's just so many myths being dispelled right now through this conversation. And I have one more.
Sure.
You also wrote a paper in Science in 2021. And this was really about metabolism throughout the lifespan. There was this idea that as we age, our metabolism slows down. And sort of the reason that we're gaining weight into our 30s, 40s, and 50s is because of that slow metabolism, right? I hear people say, when I was in college, I could eat whatever I want, and I was very slim, right? And now I can't do that. Can you tell us first, just what did you find? What was the biggest surprise when you looked across the lifespan from like 8 days old to 95 years across all these countries?
Yeah. This is a big study. Multiple labs put their data together. We ended up with like 6,200 and some people, maybe 6,400 some people in this data set. So it's a really full picture of what's going on from birth basically until really old age. And what we found is that, in childhood and through adolescence, your metabolic rate is ramped up, right? So for their bodies, obviously a 3-year-old child doesn't burn as many calories as a full adult just because they're just so much smaller, right? So that's the first thing we have to understand is body size is the biggest predictor here of how many calories you burn. If there's more of you, you burn more calories. But so taking that aside, controlling, holding body size constant, or asking, for your body size, is your metabolic rate fast or slow? Children and through adolescence have fast metabolisms. They are burning more calories. And so when your kid comes home from high school, and plows through a whole pizza, that's not, you're not imagining things that's happening. And it might be normal. Their metabolism really is really fast. But by the time, college is sort of the end of that sweet spot period. It's the end of the golden days, because by the time you're 21, 22, maybe it pushed a little bit, but early 20s, your metabolism kind of hits your adult level, right? And it's steady there from your mid 20s all the way into your late 50s. And so that weight that you're gaining in your 30s and 40s, and even maybe at the end of your 20s, it's not because your metabolism is slowing down. Your metabolism is actually super steady throughout that period. It's that, you're not eating, you're eating too many calories, basically. And there's reasons for that, not to put the blame on people. Obviously, our food environments, the kind of things we are surrounded with in the supermarket or the restaurants, make it too easy to do that. So I'm not trying to blame people for their, entirely, but that is the math of it, is that you're eating more calories, and your metabolism isn't really slowing down. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so many people, I think there's tons of articles out there that talk about how the slower metabolism, right? That's been sort of circulating for quite a while.
And I think, we don't even see a change in calories burned per day with menopause. We really expected to see that, for example. But if we track women, in their 30s and 40s versus women in their 50s, we don't see a change happening there in kind of the late 40s to early 50s like we'd expect if menopause was a big factor. It just isn't, so that's a huge surprise. And so, all these changes that we might feel as we get older, I mean, certainly, I'm almost 50. I feel differently. My body feels differently than it did when I was in my 30s and 20s, that's for sure. But those feelings, often we chalk them up to metabolism, right? Because I think it becomes this black box that we can just park all of our feelings and blame, right? Everything's your metabolism.
Yeah.
But it's not. And instead what's happening is, okay, there's some hormonal changes happening as we age. Obviously things like stress change, you've family circumstances change, jobs change, all these things change, and it changes the way we feel, and we blame it on our metabolism, but that's actually not what's changing. In fact, your metabolism is one of the few things that's not changing through your middle age.
Okay, so pretty steady through 20s to 50s, mid 60s. So what are these distinct metabolic life stages then? You said like early childhood and adolescence is sort of unique, and then I assume the older adults, there is a change there. How do you break those down?
Yeah, so we talk about 4 of them in that paper. So you're kind of born with a metabolism that's not particularly fast. It's like you're kind of like born like you're a part of mom, which is what you were for 9 months, right? And so your metabolism looks like a kind of adult metabolism the day you're born, but it quickly ramps up. And so by the time you're a 1-year-old, your metabolism is 50% faster than we'd expect it to be for your body size. So, there's no exercise program in the world that could do that for you, but it's just all your cells, and we think especially your brain, all that developmental work that your body's doing, it just takes a lot of work. And so your metabolism is really high. Yeah.
Yeah, which is also the most rapid growth. The actual height gain between 6 and 23 months is when we grow the fastest, and that brain development is incredibly important.
A big piece of that. And then you stay high through childhood, and it starts to slowly come down, but it's a long process. And so you're through childhood, we call this phase 2, from childhood through adolescence, your metabolism is still quite high and sort of slowly finding its adult level. And so there's that kind of elevated, we call it a juvenile period from early childhood all the way through late adolescence. And you're slowly gliding down, and you hit that adult level. again, early 20s. And you're there for stage 3. Your adult stage is just really steady until you get to your late 50s, early 60s. And then right around 60 years old, we begin to see a decline. And that decline happens, pretty steadily from 60 years old out, so that somebody who's 70 has a metabolism that's like 7% lower than somebody who's 60 on average. So it's about 7% per decade. And that's actually compounded by the fact that folks past the age of 60 tend to lose muscle and tend to lose body size that way. And so these changes in metabolism that I'm talking about with age are all, with keeping body mass the same, right? Like not accounting for the change in body size. Well, body size is also going to have an effect. So you have this kind of compounded effect as you get older past your 60s. People tend to lose muscle mass, and even the muscle mass they keep, the lean mass that they keep, even those cells are quieting down. And so combined together, you're seeing a slowdown in metabolism past 60.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the practical implications now? Like, do you have particular like findings that we should, or like suggestions for what we should do about these different stages?
Well, so I think what it means is we really have to make sure that we're taking care of childhood nutrition, taking that seriously, and making sure the kids have enough to eat, and that it's healthy foods and good nutrition, because obviously their nutritional needs are just so high. I think we knew that partially, but I think this really just underscores how critical that period is, especially that early childhood period. Mm-hmm. I think we need to, if we want to address weight gain in our middle age, we need to take diet seriously, because rather than blaming everything on your metabolism and the energy you're burning, I think we need to change the conversation and really focus on the foods we're eating and the ways we eat, the kind of culture around food, as to why it is that too many of us are overeating through middle age, because that's really what's to blame for the obesity crisis in middle age. And then for older folks past 60, I don't know this. We don't know this for sure yet, but it seems like if you're able to keep your metabolic rate higher, your total energy burned per day higher, that might be healthy. That might be a sign of healthy aging, right? We see a lot of variation in all these stages. Some people have higher metabolisms than others. Perhaps being able to keep your metabolism higher and either through lifestyle or diet or just other healthy aging practices might keep you in better shape as you age. That's something we'd like to explore more with future research. But my intuition is that's your metabolism is going to be a biomarker of good health and good aging past 60.
Okay, so we want that to extend. That could potentially be the goal. Extend it past beyond 60 as long as we can.
That's right.
Now, we've mentioned diet is so important for health, especially for sort of the obesity crisis and the chronic diseases. Can you talk about now your specific sort of insights about what should we be eating? Because you mentioned sort of the hunter-gatherers that you've studied around the world, especially in the warm climates. They're eating a diversity of plants and animal source foods. They're really unprocessed or minimally processed, right?
Yeah.
What is it today that we should be trying to do? Like, if it's not to model those diets, what do we take from them? What do we think about in terms of modern diets and our modern food environment?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So hunter-gatherer diets are so diverse that it's hard to pick any common thread that unites all of them. But there are a couple. One is minimal processing, like you say. And so I'd say when I go to the supermarket, and when other folks are going to the supermarket, try to avoid heavily processed foods. We know from other studies, from work by people like Kevin Hall, that those really highly processed foods are just really dangerous for our weight. They're bad for other reasons too. Epidemiologically, when they do these big, million people surveys of what people are eating and their health outcomes, again and again, we see processed meats, other processed foods showing up as associated with bad health outcomes. Mm-hmm. So, I think we have more to learn, but right now the story seems pretty clear. Stay away from highly processed foods. Secondly, across cultures, we see consistently high levels of fiber right? So I think that's a good thing to aim for, and it's kind of nice to see that in the conversation now. It's not sexy to sell foods high in fiber, but I think it's probably a good idea to eat foods that are high in fiber.
Hmm.
And then, protein is always, we've known for a long time that getting the right amount of protein is a great goal. And I'd say focus on that as well. So if you're focusing on minimally processed, get your fiber, get your protein, you start with those three, concepts, and you're going to get pretty far. Um, I don't think we have to overcomplicate it. And there's a lot of ways to get there, right? So I think it also
Hmm.
keeps the door open if people want to do that on a largely plant-based or a largely animal-based or some mix. I think, those are all concepts that you can incorporate into a lot of different diets.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, plant foods and animal foods can be minimally processed, right? They
Yep.
can both be high in protein. Of course, animal source foods are a little higher, but then the plant source foods are very high in protein. So
Yeah.
I think those three tenets of minimally processed, high in fiber, high in protein, it's hard to go wrong. Obviously, we
Yeah.
can think about preferences and tweaking things for optimal health, but those things are going to be satiating. That's sort of the key. It's
Yeah.
like I think that's one of the tricks of the hunter gatherers that they do naturally is that they eat in a way and they live their lifestyle in a way that they eat what they expend, right? They have
Yeah.
satiating foods, and that can happen with a lot of carbohydrates, like the plantains or the yucca or the cassava or
Yeah.
whatever, or the roots and tubers, the sweet potatoes or whatnot.
Yeah.
And it can happen with less carbohydrates. I think that there's a lot of tribes where we think about this worked for me or this worked for my friends and it has to work for everybody else. But really, we're very adaptable, right? And I think I want to hear, just the sort of last question about the paleo type diet
Yeah.
stuff. When you were working, you spent a lot of time with the Hadza, and I read your book in 2022, Burn, and I was very interested to hear some of your experience about other things that you kind of learned and took away. Like, there's a whole different concept of not being able to fly like thousands of miles somewhere. It's like you walk anywhere you go. It's your only mode of transportation. Can you tell us maybe I don't know, the most insightful thing or the most interesting thing that you learned from the Hadza?
Mm. Uh, yeah, I think, the thing I take away whenever I get a chance to visit, and I kind of remind myself, and it's so easy to lose, is their relationship with time and with each other. Um, we have managed to invent a whole world here in the US and other industrialized parts of the world that is, the clock is your boss. Everything has to happen, with sort of, military precision in terms of timing. There's a stress to these deadlines that we impose on ourselves. And then there's also, we lack the immediacy of having social contexts and contacts here in our, right here, right now. I love having this conversation with you, Ty, but we're not, you're not in the room with me.
Right.
And so there's an artificialness to that. There just is, and so conversations like this are great, but conversations with people in the same room with you are better.
That's right.
And I think that's what I take home. Of course, we can learn the lessons about metabolism and diet, and those are all important. But man, what really sticks with me are those kinds of things that I wish I could remember better when I come home, because it's so easy to lose it again in your phone or in your calendar or whatever. But yeah, if we can just, and I'm not saying don't be ambitious and don't work hard or anything like that, or we can all just be kind of oovy and groovy and drop out. That's not the story. Those folks in hunting and gathering societies work their butts off every day, so they work
Mhm.
hard too. But just kind of having a groundedness of what you're working for and the importance of your community. Yeah, I wish it's been a lesson for me, and something I wish everybody could hear.
Yeah, I was actually talking to my daughters yesterday. They're 8 and 6, and I was like, I'm interviewing this scientist I've been a big fan of. He studies these hunter gatherers, and they live out in nature. And they said, "Ah, no fair."
Yeah.
And And I thought, yeah, that's right. I mean, part of me was like, well, you don't know how much they work. Like, if you want to eat, you got to go gather the food. But I think there's that part of it. It's where it's like you're living with people in person and you're not stuck in a computer. You're not at the desk. You're out there and you're present. And I think there is something really, I think, almost like sort of magical that we sort of lost touch of in this. And like you said, you can experience it. It's like kind of like camping or backpacking. I've done some backpacking in my life, and I'm out in nature and I'm loving it. And you get back and there's a lot of noise, right? There's a lot of deadlines, there's a lot of stress, and it's very hard. But I think that you can probably take some of the things away where you try to make space for some of that in life, and I think that's really, I think, important. So I have not read it yet, but you just came out with a new book, Adaptable, and I'd love for you to tell us and tell the viewer and the listener, tell us about that book.
Yeah. So just in case people want to see in the flesh, my experience writing Burn was so fun, first of all, and it led to a lot of conversations like this one that I really enjoyed having. But what I've took away from the conversations that book, started, was that, not only do people not have a great grasp all the time of how our metabolism works, but really the whole human body is a mystery, to people. I think, maybe we don't do a great job in high school teaching how our biology works. We don't do a great job at all doing it. And so we're inherently curious to understand how our bodies work, and it's an important thing to understand. And, there's just a lot of misinformation out there. And if you're learning about your body on social media, I'm sorry. Hopefully, you get okay sources, but it's hard to know what's right and what's a myth. And so the Adaptable walks us through the human body from everything from embryology to old age, every different system of the body, and says, how does it work? How did it evolve? And why is it important to understand today? Because the other piece of the puzzle here is that whether we're talking about, we can go to all the hot button issues. We can talk about vaccines. We can talk about sex and gender. We can talk about IQ. We can talk about race. We can talk about the diet wars, which we talked about here. All of the big hot button issues in society today they're grounded on how we understand our biology, right? How do we make sense of any of those conversations? How do you talk about vaccines if you don't know how the immune system works, right? And so the idea isn't to get people to say that you have to think this particular way about something, but it is hopefully a chance for everybody to have an agreed upon set of facts and understand a fluency in how these things work. So, I've been teaching physiology to college students for 20 years now. And I thought, why don't we just make this available to everybody, and so get this conversation going, and it's also really fun. We get to talk about, I get to talk about my work with the Hadza and other groups like that, because of course these communities around the world that I've had a chance to work with are great examples of our bodies, in different contexts against different challenges and adapting to different environments. And so it's been really fun to write that book and to have these conversations, and I hope people will check it out.
Well, I'm going to check it out. I'm sold. I really appreciate Dr. Herman Pontzer, you taking the time and for joining me today. Thank you.
So fun to have the conversation with you, Ty. Thanks so much.